What I would say is that this isn't a general election campaign which has caught fire. The atmosphere in the press conferences have been rather calm, staid affairs, nearly similar to what you'd expect if a government was up and running and a opposition party was announcing a new policy. So we did have the Taoiseach, we had Paschal Donoghue, we had Heather Humphreys, and they were announcing basically the outline of their economic policy. But there wasn't any sort of fizz to it really, and there wasn't actually too much tension in the questions that were being asked. But just on policy, we got a bit more details. The government, or at least Fine Gael, were talking about creating 200,000 new jobs by 2025. Now, once governments start talking about creating jobs, it often causes problems in business circles because they say it's the business that creates the job. The government just creates the environment under which. But nonetheless, that's a declaration from Fine Gael. Another thing they were going to do was continuing infrastructural investment of €11 billion by 2025. Once again, thinking in the terms of a 5-year term in office. They also were talking about running a surplus by 2021 of around $4 billion a year. And this was key because they're saying they know that corporation receipts are going to go down. We could have some aftershocks of Brexit. And what they wanted to do was to have a cushion in place which would allow them to ensure that the plans they have, the economic plans, would continue irrespective of that. So that was the broad terms of it. But they spoke about tax. They said, we'll tell you about that when the manifesto is launched next week.
OK, so we'll be hearing lots more about that. And we've seen...
stand back, allow and hope that Leo Varadkar trips himself up, which he did manage to do yesterday with his gaffe in terms of calling on the Lord Mayor to make a statement in relation to that terrible incident involving a homeless man. So stand back and let Fine Gael make their own mistakes, stick to message, and then hope that none of the mud being slung at them by Fine Gael is sticking. And the big accusation against Fianna Fáil so far is that they don't have the experience to deal with the next phase of the Brexit negotiations and the trade deal. The other big accusation against them from their opponents is that they ruined the economy before, they can't be trusted. Again, Paschal Donoghue today saying it's more of the, when we have it, we spend it, policies from Fianna Fáil. But I think on the Brexit issue, Fianna Fáil is saying, this wasn't a partisan issue. It's an issue we've all been at one on, and we have done the country a certain degree of service by supporting Fine Gael in its approach on this issue. So that doesn't seem to be particularly damaging to Fianna Fáil. And there's also a question as to whether it's being raised by voters, whether they see Brexit as an issue that will determine their votes. And in terms of the economic question, I think Fianna Fáil dealt with that in the last election. It seems to be, at this point, quite an old argument to be made, even though, there are questions for the party to answer in relation to that.
Yeah, just on the Brexit and picking up from what Mary was saying, the Taoiseach was asked, you were campaigning in Dublin Central with Paschal Donoghue, you were campaigning in Virginia, County Cavan. How many people were talking about Brexit? To which the answer was none. And he went on, the Taoiseach, then to talk about what they were talking about was things like childcare. So it's interesting that Fine Gael is bigging up Brexit. The question is it actually having any traction?
Willie O'Dea said that he knocked on 1,000 doors. It wasn't raised once. Neil Richmond of Fine Gael, interestingly, said he knocked on 1,000 doors and it was raised by 600 of the households that he...
All right, of course, they'd have seen him a lot on the television in relation to Brexit. Maggie, how much are the smaller parties chafing at media perceptions or the bigger parties' perceptions of this as a two-horse race?
Well, I mean, they go out, I suppose, quite confident, and I suppose quietly confident, knowing that, they're small and that they haven't got the big machines behind them, as it were. I mean, the Social Democrats launched their campaign in Dublin city centre today at the Home statue, which is just off Sean McDermott Street in the inner city centre, and that statue is related to it's a memorial for people who've died of drug abuse. And it was, I suppose, quite a pointed situation for them today, because the one story that has been coming up is the horrific murder of Keane Mulready Woods, and it was drugs that they were asked about and how they would tackle drugs. But the Social Democrats, of course, being a small party with two TDs from the previous Dáil, chasing seats obviously, but knowing that they'll be very small, know as well that they will potentially be important in the formation of the next Dáil. Asked who would they want to go into any sort of government with, they said they weren't ruling anything out or anybody out. So they will talk to everybody, and yet still saying that the big issues that they're concerned about, health, transport, helping people insulate their homes when it comes to climate change, etc. They said that it's just lip service that has been paid to those issues up to now. So they haven't. They're criticising what's gone before, but still open to talking to everybody.
Yes.
In the future.
And of course, Dublin Central, the Social Democrats' hopes there in terms of Gary Gannon, probably elevated now with the retirement of Maureen O'Sullivan. What about the Labour Party?
So the Labour Party were talking today about crime in the north of the city, actually out at North Cross, and again related to that very tragic story. Senator Aine Lawlor was out there today. They're asking for a North Side crime task force. And really he said that that's something that, although obviously it's been highlighted because of that particular case, he talked about 6 shootings in that area, 6 murders related to gang violence and drugs. He said this is something we have been talking about for an awful long time here. I suppose something that is very real to the people whose doors he's knocking on, and certainly as well Andrew Montague, who was there with him, he's the candidate for Dublin North West. So he was saying that, look, the typical knee-jerk political reaction to anything like this is more Gardaí, more Gardaí. And that's what we have been hearing in the last 24, 48 hours over this case. So, he's saying we've been banging the drum about this for a long time. It's a task force that's needed.
And of course, Enda Kenny very closely involved in the work of the task force in Dublin, in Dublin Central, in the inner city. It just strikes me, listening to the three of you, it's the first election in a couple that is not hugely dominated by the economy, because the economy is doing well. Employment is absolutely booming. But then there are other questions, the questions around health and housing. A sense very much, is this an election that could go either way, or what do we make of it?
I do think it's wide open. Certainly, in recent days, pollsters have been saying the edge is with Fianna Fáil, but we've got a 3-week campaign still to go, and no one is going to call it at this stage, because campaigns matter. There's a dynamic and things can certainly happen. You put your finger on it to say that with the economy chugging along nicely, the question is, you can see there was a row, what our colleague Robert Short called a battle for the crown of prudence being between Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael about who would ride the economy best.
I'll trump your crash with the Fiscal Advisory Council. Yes.
So they're doing all that type of stuff. But it does raise the questions of, well, what is your priority? And that's a question which is being asked. What is your priority, given there's limited sums? Brexit could cause problems. What do you want to do? And then it's really up to the voters who are going to be interpreting this as, is that the priority I want to buy into?
Because this is the question. I mean, the parties, they're setting out their stalls. There'll be an awful lot of promises put out before us. But then you look at the process of government formation, which will involve a number of different parties, maybe independents as well. You look at, for instance, Fine Gael, the way they campaigned in the last election on a tax-cutting agenda, but ending up following pretty much the 2-to-1 spending formula that Fianna Fáil had advocated. So all of this could change the far side of an election.
Yeah, and it's interesting, talking about what are the issues going to be, and I can't remember where I heard it first, but the lived experiences of people, I think, will be interesting. We're talking about Brexit, trying to get that cut through for the Fine Gael party, but really, Brexit isn't really actually affecting our lived day-to-day experiences. However, things like, which I've heard today about families having to get loans out of the credit union to pay off drug debt so that their children won't be targeted by a drug gang, for example, or people being homeless, or children living at home because they can't. Those are lived experiences. Those are the things.
Isn't that the real challenge, I think, for Fine Gael? Because to a certain extent, they look at Brexit or they look at the economy, and they sort of say, look what we did. But to what extent is the electorate quickly to bag those advances and say, grand job, that was fine. Now, what else are you going to do for me? And they are going to have to be able to address that and articulate it.
They're suffering from what the academics describe as a governing penalty, which is the longer you are in power, the more policy failures, the more mistakes you accrue. And while the issue is economic improvement, the message they're trying to sell, the problem is that this isn't being matched by improvements in public services.
Although I don't list that argument, for instance, might travel later in the campaign. Isn't this the original Fine Gael strategy we'd heard about a while back? Leo Varadkar had spoken.
And he also said that
the last 10 days was
I think it was even the last week of the campaign was where you would see Fine Gael come through. And this is another question where a senior Fianna Fáil figure said he believed that Leo Varadkar made a strategic mistake by having a 3.5 week rather than a 4.5 week campaign. In his view, the first 2 weeks is lost in fizz. The last 10 days is when people begin to think, and if the government party has got a strong message, it comes through in those final days. And his argument was maybe Leo hasn't given himself enough time to come through. Obviously, we'll wait and see.
How important will the TV debates be then, likely if the election is as wide open or people haven't made their minds up yet?
I think they'll be very interesting from the perspective that the two main men vying to be Taoiseach are, you could argue, very close or neck and neck. You know, we have now, in maybe the first time in a couple of elections, a situation where there are two contenders for that office.
Although Sinn Féin obviously very unhappy that one of the debates is going to be a head-to-head between the two men that have been sharing confidence and supply.
Yeah, and they have
together.
a point in that confidence and supply. They see themselves as the main opposition party throughout that process. But, you know, television debates throughout the course of the European election campaigns were important, for example. So I think they will be certainly again in this campaign.
Maggie, what impact is the weather having on campaigning so far?
Oh my goodness. Well, today I can tell you it was wild. It was the kind of wind that was coming up and at you and across and around. And that was out at North Cross where Senator Aine Lawlor was kind of talking about the crime task force that he wants for the north side of Dublin. I mean, you've got to really give it to people who do go out at this time of the year and when the weather is like this, because today has just been, I would say there's one word for it and that's manky. I mean, I haven't had anybody call to my door yet of an evening, so it'd be interesting to see how people are feeling when it comes to getting cosy in the evening and, you know, on a day like today when you've been out and getting in from work, cooking the dinner, sitting down, whatever you're doing, and the doorbell goes, do you really want to let the draft in?
But maybe when you were referencing this yesterday, Mary, maybe it does lend itself to more of a social media campaign. If people are going to be listening to radio, listening to podcasts like this, trying to get the information, because that whole big canvas of 100 people marching through a street just isn't going to happen
Is
anymore.
everybody else's timeline full of TDs who've been telling you about the great reception they're getting on the
I think
doorstep
people,
or
I think
how
people
enthusiastic their teams are?
I think people are looking forward to the interaction with their representatives and candidates on the doorstep. That phrase we've heard enough of. You know, numerous studies show that we in this country really value the closeness and interaction with our public representatives in a way that they don't in other European countries by comparison.
All right, so there we go. What's planned for tomorrow? Any highlights coming up soon?
Just before we go on to tomorrow, maybe a quick word about Maureen O'Sullivan, the long-standing independent TD in Dublin Central, who announced.
Era.
I mean, I think we're 18 or 19 TDs who are now retiring, but she was someone who was always interesting. Not just the Lazarus-like recovery she made in 2016, where she'd actually, in her own mind, lost the election, had gone home, her team had gone for a drink in the pub, and suddenly the phone calls came through saying, "You better get back because you're going to take it." And one of the things I always noted about Maureen O'Sullivan in the times that she had at Leaders' Questions, she was an internationalist, a multilateralist. She was always talking about those big global questions, and one of the things that she was championing, but it isn't going to happen because the Dáil is gone and so her legislation will fall, related to child sex abuse and how to protect children. It was something she was very passionate about. So she was a real voice in the House. She was someone who was very different, who inherited her role from Tony Gregory, but is now bowing out.
Also very effective parliamentarian in terms of the what you mentioned earlier, Enda Kenny's Northern City Task Force. That was something she was raising in the Dáil consistently from a policy perspective and talking about cuts to funding to services that addressed deprivation and that addressed issues like drug abuse. And she was very persistent on that issue, which ultimately the Taoiseach of the day, Enda Kenny, set up that task force in response to that.
I saw close quarters. I remember in 2014 I was in Iran. At that time it looked as if the sanctions were going to be dropped, and she was over there as part of a foreign affairs committee, and Maureen O'Sullivan's no qualms asking anyone hard questions, doesn't matter who they are or where they are, and I just always thought she was effective.
The third independent to pull out of politics, is that a sign that the tide is maybe going out for some of them, or would you still think we'll have plenty of representation?
Well, I saw John Halligan today just walking past Buswell's. He was a spiv as always, well dressed, but he had a smile on his face as he was walking down the road, waving at me saying, "Being touched by." So I think there are a number of people who have maybe, clocked up the time and have felt they just don't want to do it anymore.
Finian McGrath will be missed as well, won't he?
Absolutely. The man who famously, as he went into the chamber, picked up his air guitar and gave it a little bit of a trill as he was heading into cabinet.
But he was a Dáil performer, as well as the parliamentarian side. He's been a Dáil performer on the opposition bench. It's probably more subdued in government, but certainly a man who...
and with colourful turn of phrase, who would, let's say, be a friend of the media.
Yes, and what was his prediction for the outcome of the election? What did he do?
Fianna Fáil, I think it was 58 seats to Fianna Fáil. He said Fianna Fáil's going to win, but as I said, 3 weeks out.
And John Halligan certainly doesn't agree with him, isn't it? And Boxamore campaigning as an independent.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at like Waterford, I mean, what is happening in Waterford? You know, DC is gone. The man we thought was going to take over him isn't running. You know, now we've got him leaving as well. I mean, fascinating constituency.
Yeah. Sinn Féin, by the way, and the incident today with their councillor and his remarks about Leo Varadkar and the apology that came.
It's interesting because actually it just took off on social media, and, you know, just looking there now before, like, you know, he's trending, and the amount of people just reading some of the comments from, he's put out a statement to say his comments were misinterpreted, but the comments underneath, it's fascinating how people are engaging in that way, because we were talking about that earlier, you know, not engaging on the front door maybe, but engaging in social media, and people are really, really engaging in this particular topic.
Is there also a lesson here for all candidates from the by-elections? If you're going to say sorry, say sorry, really, really, really sorry. Keep saying it and don't get back into justification.
But as far as we're aware, he's not a candidate. No, he's not a candidate.
No, but a lesson.
But a lesson indeed, yeah. Absolutely.
For anyone in the political sphere.
Yes.
We saw that with a number of TDs who were facing difficulties over voting. And one thing that was notable was that they took exactly that advice. They went into radio studios and just kept saying sorry for the 4 minutes that they were on air.
Okay, of course, that's along with legislation that lapses with the outgoing Dáil, for the moment anyhow, the actions against the Fianna Fáil TDs will lie in abeyance. They could be resurrected by another Dáil.
Well, it's once again, you're going to have a new committee constituted, and you know, so a new committee, new time. I'm not sure if a further complaint would have to be made, or whether the complaint made in the 32nd Dáil will continue into the next one. I don't imagine so.
Final talking point, Michael McDowell making it clear he wasn't going to be standing as a candidate in Dublin Bay South. He'd be continuing in the Shannon, where he believes he's secured the victory of this, from his point of view, of this outgoing Oireachtas, which is the filibuster on the Judicial Appointments Bill, which it appears now will not become law.
Exactly. It was a celebrity death match between himself and Minister Ross, with Minister Charlie Flanagan standing in the middle, spending so many hours in the Shannon trying to shepherd it through. But the senior counsel came through with many lengthy speeches, assisted by others, and that Judicial Appointments Bill is dead as a doornail.
Well, Shane Ross still hopes, doesn't he, Mary, that a future Dáil could resurrect it? It's open to them.
Yeah, good luck with that one, Shane Ross.
All right, well, good luck to the three of you. Thank you to you for listening and watching today. If you enjoyed the podcast, please subscribe and leave a review, and we'll be keeping you up to date with all that's happening in election 2020 as the days goes on. Slán.